Before we get into the stories, make sure you check out Donovan Dread Discovers, where I go over strange and weird videos from around the world. I release several times a week. Also, sign up for the weekly email at dreadsarmy.com so you don't miss any updates. This ordeal happened on an evening shift I spent working at Guadalupe Mountains National Park. It's located in the great state of Texas, west of Carlsbad Cavern if you're looking to place it on a map. I'm a park ranger there. It's a pretty good gig, I've got to admit. No 2 days are ever the same out there. Plus, I don't have to be stuck behind some clammy office desk all day. I wouldn't survive doing that, I'm sure of it. However, the day I want to talk to you about was not something I ever expected to encounter out there. It began pretty ordinary at first. I just started my shift in the later afternoon. I arrived at the main office. I put on my uniform, sprayed on some bug spray, laced up my boots, and got my gear loaded into the truck. As a ranger, my responsibilities may be many, but the core of it is always human and nature interaction. We look out for wildlife, making sure they're keeping to themselves and not getting too friendly with visitors. We maintain the trail system, handle any erosion in the trafficked areas, not to mention dealing with all the campers who think it's a good idea to feed the animals. So there I was, cruising through in my truck, checking on my zone like it was any other day. The air had that nice chill, the type that goes right through your clothes if you aren't wearing proper layers. The graying light was gently turning the mountains a lavender hue, like some artist took a brush to them. This is why I like the evening shift. I decided to make a stop at a remote picnic area called Pine Springs. I needed to reset a few trail signs and make sure things were as they should be. I parked the truck, got out, and stretched, enjoying the quiet that was to be found at that time of day. I had the spare signpost in one hand and hardware in the other. As I was working on fixing the sign, a strange feeling washed over me. You know that sensation where you suddenly feel like you're not alone? It was like that. It felt colder and emptier than any normal evening breeze. I halted, screwdriver in hand, and looked around, partly expecting to see a coyote out of its den or some other woodland creature. But it was just me. At least that's what I thought. After double-checking my surroundings, I told myself that it was probably a play of wind currents or just late-night jitters. I rolled my eyes at my overactive imagination and finished up the post-adjustment. But something deep inside was warning me. This wasn't just another shift. There was something strange going on here. Then, out of nowhere, a loud buzzing hit my ears. It felt like thousands of bees. It was like I had stuck my head in a hornet's nest. I shook my head and double-checked my surroundings once more. Was it another vehicle? A plane? Nothing. With all these strange happenings, my heart was pounding in my chest. I knew something wasn't right here and quickly radioed the ranger station. But I couldn't get through, and so there was no response. Just that incessant humming noise. I tried my cell, and even that was acting up. It was like all electronic devices decided to go on a strike. Just as I was turning to hop in my truck, something caught my eye. There, right above the grove of trees, was this thing. I don't even know how to describe it. It looked smooth and round, almost spherical, but not perfectly so, and it was almost undetectable with my eyes. But the humming sound gave it away. From the distance I was at, I'd say it was only a few feet across, and entirely metallic. I appeared to be glowing softly, casting an eerie light down onto the pine trees below. It just hovered there. I felt this inexplicable shudder run down my spine. Then it moved like nothing I've ever seen. It was quick and sharp. One moment it was over the trees, and the next it was swooping low, right over my head. Once it passed, the humming dulled down, and then it was gone as if it was never even there. I was left standing there, my heart pounding like a jackhammer, just staring at the night sky, the only lights being the distant stars and my truck's headlights. The rest of the night was a blur. I remember getting back in my truck and making it back to the ranger station, not daring to glance at my rearview mirror. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, pondering the bizarre events. What was that thing? Where did it go? And why here, in a remote national park of all places? Come morning, I looked for any evidence of that strange encounter. My tire tracks were still there, and so were my scattered tools by the signpost, but no sign of any metallic object or unusual tracks anywhere. It was as if it had never happened. You might think I dreamed it all up, but I know what I saw, and I know that it was real. As for my thoughts on that encounter, I don't know what to think anymore. I've been a park ranger for about 20 years now, operating mostly around Utah's Goblin Valley State Park. I've come across some odd folks and had a few close encounters with wildlife over the years, but nothing I'd ever considered unnatural. But that changed soon enough. The first reports started trickling in sometime around late May, if my memory serves. Folks in the park said they heard strange clicking noises during the night. They all had the same story, and all of them said the clicking sounded displaced, like it was metallic in nature and coming from all directions at once. Definitely not something you would expect to hear in the woods. Being the main and pretty much only ranger in these parts, it was my responsibility to check things out. Plus, the last thing I needed was some city slickers running around in a panic, claiming we got some strange creature living in our caves. That day began as usual. Rig checked, radio tuned into the local station, coffee in the thermos. I swung by the welcome center to make sure all was in order there, and then began my patrol route with the reports in mind. The first few hours were unremarkable. I checked out the camping sites, offered advice to a couple of rookie campers on bear safety, and helped in a tense moment of a family trying to locate their wandering child. But honestly, it was just another day in the life. During my lunch break, under the bright and unrelenting Utah sun, I chose one of the more remote trails to check out. It was an area several of our visitors had made reports from. I parked my rig in the shadow of the towering sandstone formations and munched on my sad excuse for a sandwich for a minute before heading out. The sound of the wind rustling the distant brush was the only thing that interrupted the desert silence. I hiked around for a little bit, really just wandering without any real direction, hoping to catch wind of the reported clicking. If I heard it, I figured I'd find a reasonable explanation for it soon enough. Maybe a trail signpost had come loose and was banging in the wind. That's usually how it goes. We get strange reports from time to time, and upon investigation, it's always something mundane because there is always a logical explanation. But then, as I neared a shallow ravine, the air just changed. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately knew you were unwelcome? It was exactly like that. But this was my park, and I wasn't going to be spooked out this easy. So, I'm standing there by the ravine, feeling this sense of dread creeping up when I hear it. It was definitely the clicking sound. It was a dizzying sequence of clicks and chitters, precisely echoing the descriptions of it in the reports. I have to admit I was a little uneasy at this point. I noted the direction of the sound and cautiously moved towards it. Turning a bend, I saw something move. A quick flash of something moving incredibly fast and utterly silent. I could only make out a vague shape, pale, somewhat human-like, and crawling on all fours. My heart pounded in my chest. You know those moments when it feels like you've stumbled into something you shouldn't have? But there I was, straining my eyes in the broad daylight, trying to wrap my head around what I had just seen. Was it a ghost? Some type of ghoul? A demon? The logical part of me thought maybe it was just some sick person, pale and emaciated, who was plagued with some mental illness that brought them out into the wild in such a state. But deep down, I knew that was not the case. I hightailed it back to the truck, my brain buzzing in an adrenaline-fueled haze. I wanted to know what that thing was, but I didn't want to know bad enough to stick around. Back at the welcome center, I took a moment to collect my thoughts. I barely remember the drive home. There was nothing in my 20 years of experience that could have prepared me for such an occurrence. I didn't have answers, but I'm not even sure I wanted them at that point. Whatever that thing was, something deep in my senses just knew that it was dangerous. You know, all those stories of people going missing around national parks. I always thought it was just ill-prepared tourists that got caught in bad weather or unsuitable terrain. But now, I think maybe there is another reason, and I think you know what I'm talking about. I tried telling some of my colleagues in town about what I'd seen, but that went nowhere really fast. I just got strange looks or jokes tossed my way. But I'm sticking with my guns. My mind and my body both know what really happened. There's undoubtedly more to the wilderness than meets the eye. And we humans are crazy if we think we know everything about the universe that there is to know. Stay safe, everyone. So, this happened when I was working as a park ranger at the Congaree National Park in South Carolina. Congaree is a special place. It's a vast, swampy, old-growth forest that could make even the most seasoned outdoorsman feel like they might just be wandering onto something magical and primal. I might just have the best office in the world, at least in my opinion. On this particular night, I was out patrolling. We had quite a few incidents involving fishermen breaking the rules that summer, either fishing without a license or taking more than the limit. We weren't sure why, but was something I had to keep an eye on. Mostly the perpetrators thought they could get away with it at night, which is why we had increased nighttime patrols. So there I was, working the night shift in Congaree. Nighttime in the park is something else. Owls hooting, coyotes howling in the distance, lots of activity as the forest's peculiar nightlife awakened. A symphony of peeper frogs singing in the swamp. I loved it, but I could see how it might seem spooky from time to time. It was basically the soundtrack of a horror film, if you thought about it that way. That night I was making my way around the Cedar Creek path. The moon was just a faint glimmer behind the clouds, providing just enough light that I didn't have to use a flashlight just yet. Something gave me pause, though, a feeling like I wasn't alone. I've spent enough nights in the woods to know when something's not right. At first, I brushed it off. It's the swamp, after all. A strange noise or an unexpected movement is all part of the package. However, this felt different. This one was a kind of silence that doesn't belong in a forest. I was nearing one of the older and less explored regions of the park when I noticed a stench that was distinctly different from the usual earthy, mossy smells you get used to in the wild. It was a sulfur-like smell. Now, here's where things started getting weird. I picked up a bizarre figure around 5 feet tall moving through the tall, sharp-edged sawgrass. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it moved swiftly on legs that were oddly angled, like they were hawked. There was something unnerving about it, but I couldn't see it clearly enough to figure out what. The silhouette looked almost like a deer. It appeared almost skeletal with a weird outer contour. I thought maybe it was just a distressed animal, tangled up in something. But then I noticed its shape more clearly. It was like some nightmarish cross between regions of the animal kingdom that aren't supposed to meet. Too big for a coyote, too strange for a bear, and definitely not any herpetological creature I can reckon. The alarms in my head were going off, but still I followed. There was a dreadful fascination about it. I had to know what it was. I moved towards the creature. The cracked twigs and disturbed underbrush indicated I was not the first to pass through this way that night. I turned a corner around a thicket of palmettos, my flashlight gripping the sweeping branches, and then I saw it. It wasn't an animal, nor a person. It was a thing, some sort of alien creature, a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. From where I stood, it seemed almost 5 feet, maybe 6 including those bizarre protuberances, which at first I took for branches stuck into matted fur, but which later I realized, to a growing horror, were, in fact, wings. They were the kind you see on bats or similar critters. No feathers, just webbed membranes stretched across its limbs. I was too fixated on the creature to worry about my safety. It was beyond belief. The head of this monstrosity was elongated like a horse's head, but the features seemed to be constantly twisting, like it might be some kind of shapeshifter. I remember its eyes were yellow and glowing against the shine of my flashlight. The creature just stood there staring at me. It seemed inquisitive almost. I stared back at it in a state of sheer confusion and terror. I watched as its long black tongue slithered from its mouth and tracing the contours of its face. It licked at the air, as if it were trying to use its tongue to smell like a snake. Parts of its body had hair like a deer, while others looked like it was sheathed in some kind of tight, scaly skin that shimmered in the light of my flashlight. I stumbled back, my heart tripping over its beats, my mind screaming at me to run, but I stood my ground. I have no idea what possessed me to do so. With a final glance at me, the creature spread its grotesque wings wide. An uncanny, ear-splitting shriek filled the air as it took flight and disappeared into the darkness. I rushed back to the station, senseless with what I'd seen. I tried to put my thoughts down into words, to rationalize it, but it was useless. I had encountered a creature something straight out of a horror novel. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder during my rounds, half anticipating and half dreading another encounter. The once familiar grounds of the Congaree National Park took on a sinister form. I didn't enjoy working the night shift anymore. I avoided it if at all possible, and the nights I did have to work, I stayed in my truck. Whether you believe my tale or not, I hope you heed caution if you ever decide to take a visit to Congaree National Park. It's a beautiful place, but I wouldn't go there after dark if I were you. The woods hold secrets beyond our understanding, so all I can say is always watch your back. A few years back, I was working as a park ranger at Tallulah Gorge State Park in Georgia. If you haven't heard of it, it's one of the most stunning landscapes you could ever encounter. Towering cliffs, an expansive river, and beautiful tall tree. But let me tell you, as gorgeous as it is during the day, there's an eeriness that descends when the night hits. I've been a fan of solitude all my life. It was one of the reasons why I chose this profession. My daily routine mostly consisted of patrolling the park, keeping an eye on any unauthorized shenanigans, making sure the visitors were safe, and maintaining the ecosystem. On this particular night, I was out on one of my usual patrols. The moon was a sliver, barely providing any light. Prime time for some of those nocturnal animals to be out and about while the human world slept. Basically, everything was as usual that night. There were a couple of owls hooting in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and silence. I was midway through my patrol when I heard it. A low but distinct growl. I almost felt it more than I heard it, and I knew instantly that this was different from any species of animal I had ever heard. It was deeper, and it sounded predatory. I paused, the sound driving me to stillness. Next, I picked up a dreadful stench like in an old, dank basement, but worse. It was moldy with a hint of something rotten. It was a revolting smell, and enough to make my stomach twist. Following my training, I started backing away slowly, thinking I had just stumbled upon an animal carcass that was likely being guarded by some hungry predator. My heart pounded in my chest. I had a white-knuckled grip on my flashlight. I kept my ears open, every creak and rustle amplifying my anxiety. The last thing I remember before rushing back to the cabin was the sight of two gleaming yellow eyes glowing in the pitch dark from amongst the trees. The eyes had a deep-set fierceness, a hunter's glare, that was unnerving to say the least. The sight of them was enough to drain the blood from my face. I escaped that night and found the safety of my truck, but I wasn't done yet. I wanted to know what that creature was, even thought I knew the part would not condone me chasing after it. So anyway, the next night I came prepared. I had my old shotgun from my hunting days, loaded with buckshot, and a high-powered flashlight strapped to my chest. This wasn't some old bear I was dealing with. The growl, the eyes I saw, and that disgusting smell all hinted at something far from normal. I knew that I needed all the protection I could get. I reached the spot, my stomach twisted in all sorts of knots, knowing something was out there. It wasn't long before it appeared. At first, it was just a silhouette against the dark backdrop of the woods. Something massive, with broad shoulders and chunky arms, 7 feet tall at least. My flashlight found it in the dark, and the beam fell on its face, and I wish it hadn't. The face I saw in the beam of my flashlight wasn't one I recognized from any animal in the park. It had a long, pronounced muzzle, with thick whiskers and a brow ridge that almost completely shadowed the deep-set, glowing yellow eyes. The face was distinctly canine, but the body resembled a human. I saw rows of jagged teeth as its snarling lips curled up in a growl that echoed around the otherwise silent woods. The body was beastly with robust dog-like legs, a hunched back, and completely covered in fur. This was straight out of a horror movie. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. That rank, putrid smell filled the air again. It was more pungent now, and so bad I could taste it. I remember the shrill of crickets abruptly halting, as a deep rumble echoed through the still night, followed by a deafening howl that seemed to shake the very ground I stood on. My instincts took over, and before I knew what I was doing, my finger had squeezed the trigger. The creature let out an aggressive grunt and shot off into the dark wilderness, at a speed that seemed impossible for any normal creature of that size. I didn't chase it or try to find where it went. I was too shaken, still working to slow down my hammering heart, and wondering if the monster would leap out from the dark woods at any moment. In the days that followed, I kept a low profile, avoiding my usual patrol routes, especially the spot where I encountered the creature. I couldn't shake off the feeling of those piercing yellow eyes watching me from the trees. I had hit the creature, but I expected it was still alive out there, and I didn't want to see it again. I'm sure it would remember me, and I might not be so lucky next time. This happened on one early morning shift at Cape Henlopen State Park, Delaware. And, just to set the scene for you, my day as a ranger usually starts pretty early, basically at the crack of dawn. Now, Cape Henlopen is my stomping ground, has been since I started working here. Mornings in the park have their own special charm as you get to know the spaces and the creatures the best at this time. On this particular day, my tasks weren't any different than usual. After a brief stop at the station to grab a cup of coffee, I headed out on patrol. Just before noon, I received a call about a curious raccoon who found himself trapped in a bear-proof trash can. That was the extent of my excitement at that point. With the raccoon rescued, I went on about with the rest of the mundane tasks on my list. It wasn't until after lunch that my day really got interesting. I got a call from the office about some strange noise complaints from the beach area. Now, ordinarily, noise complaints aren't really our department, but it was a slow day, and we had sent some people home. Also, truth be told, I was eager for a bit of a change. The beach was a short ride from where I was, so I hopped on the quad and headed off. It didn't take long to get there. I stopped the quad a bit away from the reported area and continued on foot, hoping to be able to hear better and figure out what was causing the commotion. As I walked along the shoreline, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, I started to feel weird, like it was harder to breathe and the air was heavier than normal. Now I've been in the wild long enough to know that when you get that kind of feeling, you pay attention to it. It wasn't just the weather, something else was different. Then I heard it, an uncanny screech-like sound coming from further down the shoreline, so I faced that direction and started walking. As I got closer to the sound, it became more defined, like an animal's screech, only it sounded like it was echoing, like it was coming from somewhere deeper, almost like it was resonating from a crevice or cave or something. Near where the noise was the strongest, I spotted something even stranger. There was this huge, indistinct print in the sand. This wasn't like any bird, mammal, or reptile that I'd ever seen in my years on the job. It looked, well, alien. Curiosity won over, and I followed the eerie noise and the prints, feeling the hair raising on the back of my neck all the while. The deeper I ventured into the dunes, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. Have you ever had that feeling? Like something's watching you and you just can't shake it off? It was like that. So, I slowly turned around to try and find the source, and that's when I spotted it. This big, shadowy figure, partially obscured by a dune. It was nearly 5.5 feet tall with a broad, almost human body. But its most prominent feature was this insane set of wings. They were large, refracting sunlight like black leather. I couldn't make out the details of its face, though. It was cloaked in darkness except for 2 reflective red eyes that met mine. I was paralyzed. I could feel its eyes fixed on me. It was calculating, intelligent, and for a split second I questioned my place in the natural order. I definitely did not feel powerful at that moment. In the blur of an instant, the creature let out that horrific screech again, revealing its gaping, faceless visage. And then, as quick and soundless as the wind, it disappeared. It seemed to glide rather than fly, disappearing between the dunes, leaving me alone on that desolate beach. I was quick to recover my senses. I marked the exact location and the sign in the sand of the creature's presence. And then, against every instinct screaming to investigate further, I ran. I ran towards the quad and sped away from the beach. The days following the incident were anything but normal. They were filled with restless nights and numerous questions that led to dead ends. I told my coworkers about my encounter in hopes that they could tell me what it was. But, not surprisingly, no one believed me. But then I did a little research of my own. I am now certain it was the Mothman I saw that day on the beach. There are no other creatures matching the description online. But I don't feel I can tell anyone about my findings for fear of being labeled as crazy. I already had to deal with my coworkers poking fun at me for weeks when I first mentioned it. But know this, there are things out there that might sound like they only exist in myth and legends. But I'm here to tell you that they just might be real.